Jack Morrison sat in his tiny quarters on Kepler 9 and stared at the screen in front of him. Another rejection message had arrived through the Colonial Marriage Network. This was the 7th one in 3 months. The woman's profile picture showed someone smiling in a field of golden crops on one of the inner colony worlds. She looked happy and prosperous. Her message was short and polite, but the meaning was clear enough. She wanted someone established, and Jack was not that person. He closed the message and leaned back in his chair. The metal walls of his room pressed in around him like they always did. 3 years on this mining colony had given him good experience as a terraforming engineer, but it had not made him rich. Most of his credits went to paying off his education loans and sending money back to his mother, who lived on the orbital station where he grew up. The station medical bills were expensive, and his mother needed constant care after the accident that had damaged her lungs from faulty life support systems. Jack had thought finding a wife through the marriage network would be simple enough. He was 28 years old, healthy, educated, and willing to work hard. He knew how to fix almost anything mechanical, and he had good references from his supervisors. But every woman who looked at his profile saw the same thing first. His bank balance was nearly empty. His savings account showed just enough credits to buy passage to maybe one nearby colony world, and not much else after that. The first few rejections had not bothered him too much. Jack figured those women just were not the right match anyway. But as the messages kept coming with the same basic message over and over, something inside him started to crack. One woman from an agricultural world called New Prairie had written that she needed someone who could provide security and comfort. Another from a trading hub colony had said she was looking for an established professional with property. A third had simply responded with insufficient assets, like he was a business proposal instead of a human being. The worst rejection had come just 2 days ago, from Claire Hoffman, who lived on New Haven. She was a school teacher, and her profile had seemed kind and reasonable. They had exchanged a few messages, and Jack thought maybe this time things would work out differently. Then she had asked about his financial situation, and he had been honest with her. Her response had been brutal in its directness. She wrote that she could not accept someone too poor to provide proper security, and asked him not to contact her again. She needed stability, and he could not offer that. Jack stood up and walked the 3 steps it took to cross his quarters. He looked out the small window at the barren landscape of Kepler 9 below. The mining equipment crawled across the rust-colored surface like metal insects, pulling valuable minerals from the dead planet's crust. Dust storms raged in the distance, turning the sky an ugly orange color. This was his life now, working on dead worlds, breathing recycled air, and saving credits that never seemed to add up to anything meaningful. He had grown up on Station Gamma 7, one of the older orbital platforms that housed workers and their families. His father had died when Jack was 12, caught in a decompression accident in one of the docking bays. His mother had worked double shifts to keep them fed and to send Jack to the technical academy where he learned engineering. She had wanted better for him than a life on the stations. She had pushed him to get an education and find work on the colony worlds where there was real sky above and real ground below. Jack had done everything right. He studied hard, earned his degrees, and got certified in terraforming systems and environmental engineering. He took the job on Kepler 9 because it paid well enough and gave him the experience he needed. He had always imagined that after a few years of hard work, he would move to one of the better colonies, find a good woman, and start a family. That was supposed to be how it worked. That was the dream that kept people working on places like Kepler 9. But the dream was not working out the way he had planned. Every credit he saved seemed to disappear into his mother's medical bills or his loan payments. The women on the marriage network wanted men who already had something to show for their work. They wanted property owners and successful businessmen and established professionals. They did not want a broke engineer from a mining colony who spent his days fixing water recyclers and air processors in tunnels carved into dead rock. Jack turned away from the window and sat down at his desk again. He opened the Colonial Marriage Network interface and looked at his profile one more time. The picture showed him in his work clothes, smiling despite the harsh lighting of the mining colony. His description listed his education, his work experience, and his interests. He had tried to be honest about everything, including his financial situation. Maybe that was his mistake. Maybe he should have lied or stretched the truth or found some way to make himself sound more prosperous than he really was. But Jack had never been good at lying. His mother had raised him to be honest and straightforward. She had taught him that hard work and integrity mattered more than quick credits or easy shortcuts. Those values had served him well in his career, but they were not helping him find a wife. The women on the marriage network did not care about integrity when they looked at his empty bank account. He moved his cursor over the delete button. His finger hovered there for a long moment. Then he clicked it. The system asked if he was sure he wanted to close his account permanently. Jack clicked yes without hesitating. The profile disappeared and the screen went blank. That was that then. He would focus on his work and forget about finding companionship. Maybe in another 5 years, after he paid off his loans and built up some real savings, he could try again. Or maybe he would just accept that some people were meant to spend their lives alone on cold industrial worlds. Jack stood up and grabbed his toolkit from the corner of his room. His shift started in 20 minutes and he had a malfunctioning atmospheric processor to repair in Sector 7. The work never stopped on Kepler 9. Systems broke down constantly in the harsh environment and engineers like Jack kept everything running. It was not the life he had imagined for himself, but it was the life he had. He left his quarters and headed down the corridor toward the service tunnels. The metal walls echoed with his footsteps as he walked. 3 weeks passed after Jack deleted his profile from the Colonial Marriage Network. He threw himself into his work with even more intensity than before. The mining colony administrators noticed his dedication and gave him additional responsibilities. He was now supervising a team of 3 junior engineers and overseeing maintenance on the entire eastern sector of the facility. The extra work kept his mind busy and the extra credits went straight into his mother's medical fund. One evening after a particularly long shift, Jack returned to his quarters and found a message waiting for him in his personal communication account. The sender was listed as Kate Sullivan, and the subject line simply said, "Saw your profile before you deleted it." Jack almost deleted the message without reading it. He was tired and hungry, and in no mood for whatever scam or sales pitch this was going to be, but something made him open it anyway. The message was different from anything he had expected. Kate wrote in plain, simple language without fancy words or obvious flattery. She explained that she lived on New Haven with her father, and they ran a ranch that supplied protein to 6 different colony worlds. She had been browsing the marriage network looking for potential matches when she came across Jack's profile. Something about his background had interested her, but before she could send a message, his profile had disappeared. She had a friend who worked at the network's administrative office, and that friend had given her Jack's personal contact information. Kate admitted this was probably a violation of privacy rules, and she apologized for that, but she wanted to reach out anyway because men like Jack were hard to find. She wrote that most of the men in her settlement were either boring or intimidated by her family's success. The few men from other worlds who had tried courting her could not handle the hard work that frontier ranching required. They wanted an easy life, and Kate's life was anything but easy. She had noticed several things in Jack's profile that appealed to her. He had grown up on a station, which meant he understood living in harsh environments. He worked with complex machinery, which meant he had practical skills beyond just book learning. He had been honest about his financial situation, which meant he was not trying to impress anyone with false claims. Those qualities mattered to Kate more than a fat bank account. Jack read the message 3 times, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. He looked up Kate Sullivan on the colony records database and found that she was real enough. Her identification showed she was 26 years old and listed her residence as Sullivan Ranch on New Haven. He searched for information about the ranch itself and found articles about it in the agricultural trade journals. The Sullivan Ranch was apparently one of the largest and most successful operations on New Haven. It had been started by Kate's father, George Sullivan, 40 years ago when the colony was first being established. This made even less sense to Jack. Why would the daughter of a wealthy rancher be interested in a broke engineer from a mining colony? He had been rejected by school teachers and office workers and farmers with modest holdings. Now someone from one of the most successful families on an entire planet was contacting him directly. It had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Jack composed a careful response. He thanked Kate for her message and asked her directly what she was looking for in a potential husband. He explained that he had no property, minimal savings, and significant debt from his education and his mother's medical care. He wanted to be completely clear about his situation before this conversation went any further. If she was looking for financial security or material comfort, then he was definitely not the right person. He sent the message and expected that would be the end of it. Kate's reply came back within 6 hours. She wrote that she appreciated his honesty and wanted to be equally direct with him. She needed a partner who understood hard work and would not expect her to abandon the ranch. Her father was getting older and someone needed to take over the operation eventually. She had watched too many of her friends marry soft men from the inner colony worlds who could not handle frontier life. Those marriages usually ended with the woman leaving her home to follow her husband to easier worlds or the marriage falling apart completely. Kate explained that the ranch was successful, but it required constant attention and physical labor. The machinery was always breaking down. The animals needed daily care. The land had to be managed carefully to prevent soil depletion and water waste. She needed someone who could work beside her and help modernize their operations. Intelligence and practical skills mattered more to her than inherited wealth or social status. Jack's background suggested he might be exactly the kind of person she was looking for. She proposed they exchange messages for a month and get to know each other better. If things went well after that, then Jack could visit New Haven and meet her in person. She would pay for his passage since she was the one reaching out to him. Jack could stay at the ranch for a few weeks and see if frontier life suited him. If it did not work out, then no harm done, and he could return to Kepler 9 with some credits in his pocket for the trouble. Jack sat in his quarters staring at Kate's message for a long time. Part of him was suspicious that this was too good to be true. Another part of him was intrigued by the possibility of leaving Kepler 9 and seeing a real planet with actual sky and weather. He thought about Kate's description of the ranch and the work it required. That kind of life sounded hard, but it also sounded real in a way that mining colony work was not. He drafted several different responses and deleted them all. Finally, he just wrote simply that he was interested in getting to know her better. He would exchange messages for a month like she suggested, but he insisted on paying his own passage to New Haven if things got that far. He had his pride and he was not going to start any potential relationship by taking her money. He could scrape together enough credits for one-way passage on a freight hauler. If things did not work out, he would figure out how to get back to Kepler 9 later. Kate responded that she respected his position and agreed to his terms. Over the next few weeks, they exchanged daily messages. Kate told him about life on the ranch, the challenges of frontier agriculture, and her childhood growing up in a family that valued hard work above everything else. Jack told her about the stations, his education, his work on various colony worlds, and his hopes for something better than endless tunnels and recycled air. Their conversations felt natural and easy. Kate had a sharp sense of humor, and she did not waste words on unnecessary pleasantries. She asked direct questions about his skills and experience. Jack found himself looking forward to her messages at the end of each shift. For the first time in months, he felt like someone actually saw him as more than just a bank balance on a screen. Jack booked passage on a freight hauler called the Prairie Star that made regular runs between the industrial colonies and the agricultural worlds. The journey would take 6 weeks through the hyperspace lanes. He used almost all of his remaining savings to pay for the trip and basic accommodations. His supervisor on Kepler 9 was sorry to see him go, but wished him luck. The junior engineers he had been training threw him a small going-away party in the station's common room. They gave him a worn but functional multi-tool as a parting gift. The Prairie Star was not built for comfort. Jack's cabin was barely larger than a storage closet with a narrow bunk and a small desk bolted to the wall. But it had a viewport, and that was luxury enough for someone who had spent years in windowless tunnels. He spent hours each day staring out at the stars and the strange colors of hyperspace as the ship traveled between systems. During the voyage, he and Kate continued their daily messages. She sent him pictures of the ranch and the surrounding landscape. He sent her technical diagrams of equipment repairs he thought might help their operations. Kate told him more about her father during those weeks. George Sullivan had been a soldier on Earth before coming to New Haven as part of the first wave of colonists. He had claimed a piece of land that nobody else wanted because it was too far from the main settlement. Then he had spent 40 years building it into something remarkable through sheer stubbornness and endless work. Kate had grown up learning that nothing worth having came easy. Her mother had died when Kate was 12 from a fever that the colony doctors could not treat. After that, it had been just Kate and her father running the ranch together. Jack shared more about his own past during those weeks, too. He told Kate about his father's death and his mother's sacrifice to get him educated. He explained why he sent most of his earnings back to the station to cover medical costs. He described the strange isolation of growing up in an artificial environment where everything from air to water was rationed and controlled. Kate listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions. She seemed to understand that his poverty came from duty and loyalty, rather than laziness or poor choices. When the Prairie Star finally dropped out of hyperspace near New Haven, Jack pressed his face against the viewport and stared at the planet below. It was beautiful in a way he had never experienced before. The world was mostly green and blue with white clouds swirling across the surface. He could see oceans and continents and mountain ranges. It looked nothing like the barren rocks and industrial stations he had known his entire life. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to hope that maybe this could actually work out. The ship docked at the spaceport near Foundation, which was the main settlement on New Haven. Jack gathered his single bag of belongings and made his way through the passenger corridors to the exit. The moment he stepped off the ship, he felt the difference. Real gravity instead of the artificial spin of a station. Real air that smelled of plants and soil instead of recycled filters. Real light from an actual sun instead of overhead panels. It was overwhelming and wonderful at the same time. Kate was waiting for him at the landing pad just like she had promised. Jack recognized her immediately from her pictures. She was tall and lean with sun-darkened skin and auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore work clothes that had clearly seen plenty of use. Sturdy pants, a faded shirt, and boots that were scuffed and worn. She looked exactly like what she was, which was someone who spent her days doing hard physical labor. She walked up to Jack and stuck out her hand for a firm shake. Her grip was strong and her eyes studied him carefully. Kate loaded Jack's bag into the back of her hover truck without any fuss. The vehicle was old, but well-maintained with patches of welded metal where repairs had been made over the years. She climbed into the driver's seat and Jack got in beside her. They drove out of the spaceport and headed away from Foundation toward the open countryside. Kate pointed out landmarks as they traveled and explained the layout of the colony. Foundation had maybe 20,000 people. The rest of New Haven's population was spread across farms and ranches and small settlements scattered across the main continent. The Sullivan Ranch covered nearly 200 square kilometers, according to Kate. The property had natural water sources, including a river that ran through the northern section. The grasslands were perfect for raising cattle that had been genetically modified to thrive in New Haven's environment. They also grew some crops for their own use and maintained equipment to process the meat they shipped to other colony worlds. Kate explained all this in a matter-of-fact way while Jack stared out the window at the endless, rolling hills and open sky above. After an hour of driving, they turned onto a dirt road that led toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Kate told him they were almost home. The main ranch house came into view first. It was a large structure built from local timber and stone with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Behind it, Jack could see equipment sheds, processing facilities, storage buildings, and several smaller structures that Kate said were living quarters for the ranch workers. Everything was solid and functional without any wasted decoration or unnecessary fancy touches. Kate parked the truck near the main house and grabbed Jack's bag before he could. She led him inside and showed him to a small but comfortable guest room on the second floor. The room had a real window that looked out over the ranch property and the hills beyond. Kate told him to get settled and then come downstairs for dinner. Her father wanted to meet him and they ate at 6 o'clock sharp every evening. She left Jack alone and closed the door behind her. Jack set his bag on the bed and walked to the window. The sun was getting low on the horizon and the light turned everything golden. He could see cattle grazing in distant fields and workers moving between buildings. Smoke rose from what looked like a processing facility. The whole operation was impressive in its scale and organization. He thought about the fact that Kate and her father ran all of this with just hired help and no fancy automated systems. It was the kind of challenge that made his engineer's mind start calculating improvements and solutions. He washed up using the small bathroom attached to the guest room. Real water came from the tap instead of the recycled gray stuff he was used to. He changed into clean clothes, which was basically another set of work clothes since that was all he owned. Then he headed downstairs to meet George Sullivan and see if the man would accept him or send him packing back to the spaceport. Jack had faced difficult situations before, but somehow this felt more important than anything else he had ever done. George Sullivan was waiting in the dining room when Jack came downstairs. The man was in his early 60s with broad shoulders and a weathered face that showed decades of working under an alien sun. His hair was steel gray and cut short. His eyes were sharp and missed nothing as they studied Jack from head to toe. He did not offer a handshake or a smile. He just nodded toward a chair and told Jack to sit down. Kate brought food from the kitchen and set it on the table. It was simple frontier fare with roasted meat, vegetables from their garden, and fresh bread. George said a brief blessing over the food and then they started eating. For several minutes nobody spoke. Jack focused on his meal and tried not to feel like he was being examined under a microscope. Finally, George set down his fork and began asking questions. He wanted to know about Jack's background, so Jack told him about growing up on station Gamma 7. George asked about his father's death, and Jack explained the decompression accident without going into too much detail. George asked about his education, and Jack listed the technical schools he had attended and the certifications he had earned. George asked about his work experience, and Jack described his time on various colony worlds, including the 3 years on Kepler 9. Every answer led to another question as George probed deeper into Jack's history and qualifications. Then George asked about his financial situation, and Jack gave him the honest truth. He explained his student loans, his mother's medical expenses, and the fact that he had spent almost everything he owned just to get to New Haven. He told George that he understood if this was a problem, and he would leave in the morning if that was what they wanted. George listened to all of this without any change in his expression. Then he asked why Jack thought he was good enough for his daughter. Jack took a moment to consider his answer carefully. He said he did not know if he was good enough for Kate, but he knew he would work harder than anyone else George could find. He was willing to learn whatever needed learning and do whatever needed doing. He understood that frontier life was difficult, and he was not afraid of difficult things. He had spent his whole life working with his hands and his brain to solve problems and keep systems running. If George gave him a chance, Jack would prove his worth through action rather than words. George stared at Jack for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up. He told Jack to follow him. Kate gave Jack an encouraging look as the two men left the house. George led him across the compound to one of the larger equipment buildings. Inside was the ranch's water reclamation system, a massive installation of pipes and tanks and filtration units that had clearly been imported from Earth many years ago. George explained that the system had been losing efficiency for the past 6 months and nobody could figure out why. Jack walked around the equipment asking questions about when the problem started and what symptoms they had noticed. George described how the output had gradually decreased and the energy consumption had increased. Jack asked if he could run some diagnostics, and George handed him a portable scanner from a nearby toolbox. Jack spent the next hour examining every part of the system, while George watched in silence. He checked the filtration arrays, tested the flow sensors, reviewed the control software, and measured the mineral content in the water samples. Finally, Jack straightened up and explained what he had found. The filtration arrays had accumulated mineral deposits over years of operation. This was normal and expected, but the automatic cleaning cycle that was supposed to handle it had a software glitch. The glitch prevented the cleaning sequence from completing properly, so the deposits just kept building up. The increased buildup restricted water flow, which forced the pumps to work harder, which increased energy consumption. The fix was relatively simple, but required someone who understood both the mechanical systems and the software controls. George asked Jack if he could fix it. Jack said yes, but it would take a few hours and he would need some basic supplies. George told him to make a list and Kate would get whatever he needed from the workshop. Jack wrote down what he required and Kate disappeared to gather the items. George pulled up a chair and sat down to watch. He told Jack to go ahead and get started. If Jack could actually fix this system, then they would talk more about the future. If he could not, then at least they would know where things stood. Jack worked through the evening and into the night. Kate brought him tools and supplies as needed. She stayed to help, holding lights and handing him equipment while he crawled inside the filtration units. George sat in his chair and watched everything without comment. Jack carefully cleaned the mineral deposits from the arrays using a chemical solution that would not damage the delicate membranes. Then he accessed the control computer and dug through the code until he found the glitch. It was a timing error in one of the subroutines that caused the cleaning cycle to terminate early. He corrected the code and ran several test sequences to make sure it was working properly. By midnight, the system was running at full efficiency again. The output readings showed normal flow rates and the energy consumption had dropped back to expected levels. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and turned to George. He said the repairs should hold indefinitely, as long as they ran the cleaning cycle according to the schedule he had programmed. George stood up and walked over to examine the control panel. He checked the readings himself and nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and clapped Jack firmly on the shoulder. George told Jack that he would do just fine. A man who could diagnose and fix a complex problem like that was worth more than someone with a fat bank account and soft hands. George said his wife had always told him that character showed through in how a person approached work. Jack had demonstrated good character. The three of them walked back to the main house together. Kate made coffee and they sat in the kitchen talking until almost 2 a.m. George told stories about the early days of the colony when they had nothing but basic tools and determination. Kate talked about growing up on the ranch and learning to handle everything from equipment maintenance to animal medicine. Jack shared some of his own experiences from different colony worlds and the strange situations he had encountered. The conversation was easy and comfortable. George asked Jack what he thought of New Haven so far, and Jack said honestly that it was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. Before they went to bed, George told Jack he was welcome to stay as long as he wanted. There was plenty of work to do around the ranch, and Jack clearly knew what he was doing. They could work out proper arrangements later, but for now, Jack should just focus on learning the operation and seeing if this life suited him. Jack thanked George and said he would not let them down. He went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling for a while before sleep finally came. For the first time and longer than he could remember, Jack felt like he had found a place where he belonged. The work would be hard and the challenges would be constant, but that did not bother him. Hard work he could handle. What he had never been able to handle was the feeling that his efforts did not matter, or that people only valued him for what he owned rather than what he could do. Here on the Sullivan Ranch, it seemed like the opposite was true. George and Kate cared about practical skills and honest effort. That was something Jack could provide in abundance. Jack and Kate were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The local minister came out from Foundation to perform the service. The ranch workers attended along with neighbors from surrounding properties and a few friends from town. George stood beside his daughter looking proud and emotional in equal measure. Jack wore new clothes that Kate had insisted on buying for him. She wore a simple dress that had belonged to her mother. They exchanged vows under the open sky with the ranch land stretching out behind them. The ceremony was short and practical, just like everything else on the frontier. Afterward, there was food and music and dancing in the equipment yard that had been cleared and decorated for the occasion. Neighbors brought dishes and drinks. Someone had a music player with old Earth songs. People danced and laughed and celebrated until well after dark. Jack found himself pulled into conversations with ranchers and farmers who wanted to know about his engineering background. Several mentioned equipment problems they had been struggling with and asked if he might have time to take a look sometime. Those 3 months before the wedding had been the hardest and best time of Jack's life. He had worked alongside Kate and George from sunrise to sunset, learning everything about running a frontier ranch. The work was physically demanding in ways his engineering jobs had never been. He learned to handle livestock, mend fences, operate heavy machinery, and deal with the 100 small crises that happened every day. His hands got calloused and his muscles got stronger. His skin darkened from constant sun exposure. But while Kate taught him about ranching, Jack taught her and George about engineering. He examined every system on the ranch with a critical eye. The irrigation setup was inefficient and wasted water. The power collectors were outdated and could not store enough energy for peak demand periods. The meat processing equipment broke down constantly because it was worn out and poorly maintained. The automated feeding systems for the livestock required constant manual intervention because the sensors were miscalibrated. Jack created a plan to modernize the ranch infrastructure in stages. They could not afford to replace everything at once, but they could upgrade the most critical systems first and then work their way through the rest over time. George was skeptical at first about spending credits on improvements when the old system still functioned after a fashion. But Kate argued that Jack's ideas would save them money in the long run through reduced waste and better efficiency. She had watched him work and trusted his judgment. They started with the irrigation system. Jack redesigned the water distribution network to eliminate waste and ensure even coverage across all the fields. He installed better flow controls and monitoring equipment so they could adjust water delivery based on actual soil conditions instead of just guessing. The project took 3 weeks of hard work, but when they were finished, the water consumption dropped by 30% while the grass quality actually improved. Next, Jack tackled the power collection and storage systems. New Haven had excellent solar conditions, and the ranch had plenty of space for collector arrays. But the existing equipment was first-generation technology that had been installed 40 years ago. Jack designed a hybrid system that combined improved solar collection with a wind generation backup for the frequent storms that rolled across the plains. He built much of the equipment himself using salvaged parts and materials purchased from suppliers in Foundation. The new system produced twice the power of the old one and stored enough energy to run the ranch through several days of bad weather. George was impressed enough by these results that he gave Jack free rein to work on whatever he thought needed fixing. Jack went through the ranch like a force of nature, repairing equipment that others had declared beyond saving. He fixed the meat processing machinery by fabricating new parts to replace worn components. He recalibrated the automated livestock systems so they actually worked as designed. He even improved the living quarters for the ranch workers by installing better climate control and water heating. Word spread quickly among the neighboring ranches about the improvements Jack was making at the Sullivan property. Other ranchers started showing up asking for help with their own equipment problems. Jack spent his evenings and occasional days off consulting for neighbors. He never charged much for this work because most frontier ranchers operated on tight margins just like the Sullivans did, but the goodwill he generated was valuable in its own way. The Sullivans were no longer just successful ranchers, but also the people who had brought real technical expertise to the region. Kate worked beside Jack through all of this. She showed him the practical side of ranching, while he showed her the technical possibilities for improvement. They made a good team with complementary skills and similar work ethics. They fell into comfortable routines of shared labor and shared meals and shared evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch lands. Their relationship grew from mutual respect into genuine affection. Jack found himself happier than he had ever been despite working harder than ever. Every morning he woke up to real sunlight coming through the window. Every day he worked on problems that had visible solutions and immediate results. Every evening he sat down to dinner with Kate and George and talked about the day's challenges and victories. It was simple and straightforward, and deeply satisfying in ways that his previous life had never been. He still sent money back to his mother on Station Gamma 7, but now he could afford to send more because he was not paying for his own housing or food. His mother wrote that she was doing better and the doctors were pleased with her progress. She said she was proud of him for finding a good woman and building a real life on a colony world. That was all she had ever wanted for him. The ranch began to thrive under the combined efforts of Jack's engineering improvements and Kate's steady management. Their cattle herds grew healthier because the automated systems now worked properly and caught problems early. Their meat quality improved because the processing equipment maintained better temperature controls. Their costs decreased because they wasted less water and power. Their reputation grew because they could reliably meet their contracts with other colony worlds. George watched all of this with satisfaction. He told Jack one evening that bringing him to the ranch was the best decision Kate had ever made. The old man admitted he had been skeptical at first about a broke engineer from a mining colony, but Jack had proved his worth many times over. George said that when the time came to officially transfer ownership of the ranch, he would be splitting it between Kate and Jack as equal partners. They would carry on what he had built and probably make it even better. Jack was moved by George's words more than he wanted to admit. He had spent so much of his life feeling like he was never quite good enough or successful enough. The rejections from the marriage network had reinforced that feeling. But here on the Sullivan Ranch, nobody cared about his empty bank account or his lack of property. They cared about what he could do and how hard he was willing to work. That was the kind of judgment Jack could live with. 6 months after arriving on New Haven, Jack stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out over the property. Kate came out and stood beside him. She took his hand and they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence. Jack thought about the path that had brought him here from the stations to the mining colonies, to this ranch on a frontier world. It had not been the path he planned, but it had worked out better than anything he could have imagined. The emergency broadcast system activated on a cool autumn morning, when Jack and Kate were checking the northern fence lines. Every communication device on New Haven suddenly blared the colonial alert tone. Jack pulled out his portable unit and saw the message scrolling across the screen. An unidentified spacecraft had entered the New Haven system. The vessel was massive, larger than anything humanity had ever constructed. It was not responding to hails from the Colonial Defense Force. The ship was on a direct course for New Haven orbit. Jack and Kate looked at each other and then immediately headed back to the ranch house. George was already in his office monitoring the Colonial Emergency Channel when they arrived. The three of them listened as the Colonial Governor tried to maintain calm, while clearly being terrified herself. The Defense Force had scrambled their 3 patrol ships, but everyone knew those small vessels would be useless against a ship the size of the one approaching. The governor ordered all settlements to continue normal operations while they attempted to establish communication with the unknown vessel. 2 hours later, the alien ship entered orbit and finally responded. The message was broadcast simultaneously to every communication device on the planet. The voice was cold and mechanical but spoke perfect English. The species identified themselves as the Krell. They had been observing human expansion into this region of the galaxy for the past 50 years. They had watched humanity establish colonies and spread across dozens of worlds. Now the time had come for humanity to accept its proper place in the galactic order. The Krell message was simple and direct. Humanity would submit to Krell oversight and surrender sovereignty over all colony worlds. In exchange, the Krell would provide protection from other hostile species and access to advanced technology. Humans would be allowed to continue their daily lives under Krell supervision. Resistance would result in the complete destruction of the colony world, starting with New Haven. The Krell gave humanity 72 hours to accept these terms. After that deadline, the Krell fleet would begin enforcing compliance. Panic spread through Foundation and the surrounding settlements. The colonial governor called an emergency meeting and opened it to all citizens through the communication network. Jack, Kate, and George watched as hundreds of frightened people filled the town hall, and thousands more participated remotely. The arguments started immediately. Some people advocated instant surrender to avoid bloodshed. Others wanted to fight despite the hopeless odds. Many simply did not know what to do, and looked to their leaders for guidance that those leaders could not provide. The governor contacted the inner colony worlds, seeking instructions or assistance. The response was not encouraging. The nearest military ships were 3 weeks away at best. The colonial government on Earth expressed sympathy but offered no concrete help. Every human colony was on its own and everyone knew it. The Krell had chosen their moment perfectly, targeting an isolated agricultural world that had minimal defenses and no hope of quick reinforcement. Public meetings continued throughout the day as people tried to figure out what to do. Jack and Kate attended the gathering in Foundation that evening. They listened to their neighbors argue about surrender versus resistance. Some pointed out that the Krell had superior technology, and resistance would be suicide. Others argued that submission meant losing everything that made them free human beings. A few suggested trying to negotiate better terms, but nobody really believed the Krell would bargain. Jack sat quietly through most of the meeting and listened. He thought about the Krell message and what it really meant. Submission would not be temporary. Once humanity surrendered sovereignty, they would never get it back. The Krell would control human worlds forever. Human culture would slowly be eroded and replaced with whatever the Krell wanted. Future generations would grow up as subjects of an alien empire. That was not acceptable. That night back at the ranch, George gathered Jack and Kate in his study. The old man looked tired, and every one of his 60-plus years showed on his face. But his eyes were hard as steel when he started talking. George told them something he had never mentioned before. Before coming to New Haven, he had served in Earth's military during the Resource Wars. He had seen what happened when one power submitted to another. The promises of protection and prosperity always turned into exploitation and oppression. Freedom once surrendered was almost impossible to reclaim. George said he would rather die free than live as a subject of alien masters. He had not spent 40 years building this ranch just to hand control over to some species that thought humans should know their proper place. Kate agreed immediately. She had grown up free on this ranch, and she would not accept chains even if they came with fancy technology and false promises of security. Jack found himself nodding along with both of them. He had not come all this way to build a new life just to give it up without a fight. But what could they actually do? 3 small patrol ships against a massive alien vessel was not even a fair fight. The entire colonial defense force of New Haven could not scratch the Krell ship. Ground weapons would be useless against an enemy in orbit who could simply destroy targets from space. Conventional military resistance was suicide. Yet surrender was unacceptable. There had to be another option. Jack spent that night thinking about the problem from every possible angle. He lay in bed beside Kate, staring at the ceiling, while his mind worked through scenarios and possibilities. Humanity could not match Krell technology in direct confrontation. That much was obvious. But maybe they did not need to win a military victory. Maybe they just needed to make conquest too expensive or too difficult to be worthwhile. The Krell had given humanity 72 hours to decide. That suggested they wanted compliance rather than destruction. They clearly had the power to simply annihilate the colony worlds without warning, but they had not done that. Instead, they had offered terms and a deadline. That meant something. Maybe it meant the Krell operated under some code of conduct that required consent, however forced. Or maybe it meant they needed something from humanity that would be lost if they just destroyed everything. By morning, Jack had the outline of an idea. It was desperate, and probably would not work, but it was better than either surrender or hopeless military resistance. He explained his thinking to Kate and George over breakfast. The Krell wanted compliant human colonies they could control and exploit. What if humanity demonstrated that conquest would cost more than it was worth? Not through military resistance, but through pure, stubborn destruction of everything the Krell might want. George leaned forward with interest as Jack continued. They could rig every valuable asset on New Haven to be destroyed rather than captured. Processing facilities could be set to explode. Herds could be released or slaughtered. Water sources could be poisoned. Food stores could be burned. The entire infrastructure could be wired to fail catastrophically if the Krell tried to take control. The message would be clear. You can have a barren rock full of rubble, or you can leave and find easier prey. Kate pointed out they would need to convince the governor and the Colonial Council to implement such a plan. They would need the cooperation of every settlement and every major operation on the planet. It would be an enormous coordinated effort with very little time to organize it. George smiled grimly and said they should start with their neighbors. The ranching and farming communities represented most of New Haven's economic value. If they could get the agricultural sector on board, the rest might follow. Jack, Kate, and George spent the rest of that morning creating a simple plan that could be implemented quickly with available resources. Jack drew up basic diagrams showing how to rig equipment and facilities for controlled destruction. Nothing too complicated or requiring special skills. Simple charges placed at critical points, fail-safe triggers that could be activated remotely or manually, and poison compounds that could contaminate resources. The goal was not sophisticated sabotage, but rather demonstrating complete willingness to destroy everything, rather than let it fall into Krell hands. By afternoon, they were visiting neighboring ranches. Kate drove while Jack and George explained their idea to anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Frontier colonists understood that survival depended on their own actions, not waiting for someone else to save them. Within hours, a network of determined ranchers and farmers had agreed to implement Jack's defensive measures. They would rig their equipment to fail if tampered with, poison their water sources if invaded, and destroy their stockpiles rather than surrender them. The plan spread from ranch to ranch across the agricultural regions. Farmers who supplied crops to other worlds agreed to burn their fields. Ranchers who raised livestock agreed to release or slaughter their herds. Processing facility operators agreed to sabotage their own equipment. Everyone understood this might mean economic ruin, but that was better than alien servitude. Word spread to the industrial settlements where factory workers and engineers embraced similar measures. By evening the second day after the Krell ultimatum, more than half of New Haven's population was actively preparing to make the planet worthless to potential occupiers. Jack worked with groups of technicians and engineers, showing them how to create simple but effective sabotage systems. He emphasized that everything had to be ready, but not activated until absolutely necessary. They were creating a threat, not actually destroying things yet. The goal was to demonstrate that occupation would gain the Krell nothing but rubble and corpses. He also stressed that every system needed manual override so nothing would be triggered by accident. Kate organized the agricultural sector and coordinated communication between different settlements. She made sure everyone understood the timeline and what signals would indicate it was time to actually implement the destruction protocols. George worked with the governor and colonial council, convincing them to support the plan officially. He used his reputation and status as a founding colonist to argue that frontier people had not come all this way just to surrender their freedom to aliens. The governor was initially resistant. She worried about provoking the Krell into immediate attack. She argued they should at least try to negotiate or stall for time, while waiting for help from the inner worlds. George bluntly told her that help was not coming in time, and the Krell were not interested in negotiation. The aliens had made their terms clear: submission or destruction, but there was a third option, which was making submission pointless by ensuring there would be nothing left to rule over. On the morning of the third day, with only hours remaining before the Krell deadline, the governor made her decision. She would support the plan and broadcast humanity's response to the Krell. Jack helped write the message while Kate gathered documentation of the preparations. They needed to show the Krell that this was not an empty threat but a genuine commitment, backed by actual readiness to follow through. The broadcast went out simultaneously on all frequencies, including the channel the Krell had used for their original message. The governor stood in the colonial government building with George Sullivan beside her, and representatives from every major settlement and industry on New Haven visible on screens behind her. She addressed the Krell directly and clearly. Humanity would not submit to alien rule. Moreover, if the Krell attempted to take New Haven by force, they would find every resource destroyed and every facility rigged to explode and every colonist willing to die rather than serve. The broadcast included footage from across the planet showing the preparations. Ranches where livestock had been released into the wild and buildings were wired with charges. Factories where critical machinery had been sabotaged. Water treatment plants that were ready to contaminate their own supplies. Food storage facilities with incendiary devices in place. The message was absolutely clear. The Krell could have a barren devastated, rock filled with nothing but rubble and bodies, or they could leave and find easier prey elsewhere in the galaxy. The governor continued speaking directly to the Krell. She explained that humans were not a species that submitted easily. They had spread across hostile worlds and survived impossible conditions through sheer determination and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Every colonist on New Haven understood that freedom was worth more than life. They would destroy everything they had built, rather than let aliens take it. There would be no compliant workforce, no intact infrastructure, and no easy conquest. Only scorched earth and dead colonists. Jack stood with Kate and George in the ranch house watching the broadcast. His stomach was tight with tension. Everything now depended on how the Krell would respond. If they simply attacked immediately, then New Haven would be destroyed and thousands of people would die. But Jack had gambled that the Krell wanted something more than just destruction. They had offered terms instead of simply attacking. That suggested they operated under rules or had goals that required human cooperation. Taking a planet full of rubble served no purpose. The response came within an hour. The Krell vessel transmitted a new message, and the tone was different from before. The cold mechanical voice now carried something that almost sounded like respect. The Krell acknowledged humanity's response and stated that they had indeed been testing the human species. Many species, when confronted with superior force, immediately submitted. Those species were suitable for incorporation into the Krell domain as worker populations. But a species willing to destroy itself rather than submit was different. The Krell explained that they had encountered few species with that level of determination. Such species were not suitable for domination because they could never be truly controlled. The cost of ruling them would always exceed the benefit. The Krell had learned this lesson over thousands of years. Therefore, they would offer humanity a different arrangement. Humanity would remain fully sovereign over their colony worlds. The Krell would establish trade relations and would expect humans to defend their own territory without Krell protection or interference. The message continued with what sounded almost like approval. The Krell stated that humanity had passed a crucial test. Not every species was given this opportunity. Many were simply conquered because they submitted too easily or fought too stupidly. But humans had demonstrated the precise balance of pragmatism and stubbornness that indicated they were a species worth respecting. The Krell would withdraw from New Haven immediately. Future contact would be for trade and information exchange only. Humanity would be free to continue expanding across the galaxy as long as they could defend what they claimed. Silence followed the Krell message. Then slowly people across New Haven began to realize what had just happened. They had not surrendered. They had not been destroyed. Instead, they had earned something almost unbelievable, which was alien respect. The Krell ship began moving out of orbit while Jack and Kate and George watched the tracking data. The massive vessel accelerated away from New Haven and soon disappeared into hyperspace, leaving the colony intact and free. Foundation erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets, cheering and crying and embracing each other. Similar scenes played out across every settlement on the planet. The ranches and farms that had been prepared for destruction stood ready but unused. The equipment that had been rigged for sabotage could be carefully disarmed. The herds that had been released could be rounded up again. New Haven had survived and remained free through a combination of desperation, determination, and the kind of stubborn human ingenuity that refused to accept the supposedly inevitable. Jack stood on the porch of the ranch house with Kate beside him and George behind them. They watched the sun set over the ranch lands that they had been prepared to destroy rather than surrender. George clapped Jack on the shoulder and said what everyone across the colony worlds would soon be saying. Sometimes the poorest man in terms of credits was the richest in the ways that truly mattered. Jack had come to New Haven with nothing but his skills and his willingness to work. He had helped save not just his adopted home, but had demonstrated the stubborn determination that defined humanity's place in the galaxy. News of what happened on New Haven spread across the human colony worlds faster than any ship could travel. The story was transmitted through the hyperspace communication network that connected the scattered human settlements. A small agricultural colony had faced an alien ultimatum and refused to surrender. More importantly, they had demonstrated a method of resistance that did not require military superiority. They had simply made conquest too expensive to be worthwhile through sheer willingness to destroy everything rather than submit. Other colony worlds studied what New Haven had done and began implementing similar defensive preparations. Not because they expected immediate alien threats, but because the Krell had revealed something important. Humanity was not alone in the galaxy, and not every species they encountered would be friendly. The traditional approach of waiting for military rescue from the inner worlds was not viable for frontier colonies. They needed to be able to defend themselves through whatever means available. Jack Morrison became a legend across the frontier worlds, though he did not particularly want the fame. Reporters came to New Haven asking for interviews. Colony administrators invited him to visit their worlds and consult on defensive preparations. He politely declined most of these requests. He was not a hero or a strategist or a military leader. He was just an engineer who had applied practical problem-solving to an impossible situation. Besides, he had work to do on the ranch and a life to live with Kate. The Sullivan Ranch prospered in the years after the Krell incident. Jack continued modernizing their operations while Kate managed the daily activities of running a massive agricultural enterprise. George gradually stepped back from active management, though he still spent his days working around the property and offering advice when asked. The old man seemed content knowing that the ranch would continue in capable hands after he was gone. Jack and Kate had their first child 2 years after the Krell encounter. They named her Helen after Jack's mother, who had passed away peacefully 6 months earlier. The baby was healthy and strong and grew up surrounded by the ranch lands and the endless sky above. Over the next several years, 3 more children followed, 2 boys and another girl. The kids learned to work alongside their parents, from an early age, just as Kate had learned from George. The children grew up, hearing stories about their father's arrival on New Haven and his role in the Krell crisis, but they also learned that those events were not what defined him. What mattered was the daily work of maintaining equipment, caring for livestock, managing resources, and building something lasting through consistent effort. Jack made sure his kids understood that success came from persistence and practical skills rather than dramatic gestures or lucky breaks. George Sullivan lived to see his grandchildren grow into competent young ranchers and engineers. He passed away at 73 after a brief illness with Kate and Jack at his bedside. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across New Haven, neighboring ranchers, town administrators, Colonial Defense Force personnel, and ordinary colonists who had never met him personally, but respected what he represented. He had been one of the founding generation who had built something real on a frontier world through decades of hard work. The Sullivan Ranch continued to expand over the following years. Jack's technical improvements combined with Kate's management skills made them one of the most efficient operations on New Haven. They supplied protein to a dozen different colony worlds and maintained a reputation for reliability and quality. Other ranchers regularly consulted with them on equipment and methods. The Sullivan name became synonymous with successful frontier agriculture. Jack never forgot the rejections he had received through the colonial marriage network. Sometimes late at night he would think about those women who had dismissed him for being too poor. He wondered what their lives had turned out like. He felt no bitterness toward them, though. They had made their choices based on what they valued, and that was their right. He was simply grateful that Kate had valued different things and seen potential where others had seen only poverty. Kate would sometimes joke that she got the better end of their arrangement. She had found a husband who could fix anything, understood hard work, and never complained about the difficulties of frontier life. Jack would respond that he got to wake up every morning on a beautiful planet with a strong, capable partner, and work that actually mattered. They both knew they were lucky to have found each other, even though it had happened in an unconventional way. The Krell kept their word about establishing trade relations with humanity. Ships bearing Krell goods began appearing at various colony worlds, including New Haven. The trade was always fair and straightforward. The Krell offered advanced technology in exchange for human-manufactured goods and agricultural products. They never again attempted to dominate or control human colonies. Some humans remained suspicious of Krell intentions, but most accepted that the initial confrontation had established clear boundaries. Jack occasionally dealt with Krell traders who came to New Haven, seeking meat shipments. The aliens were strange in appearance and manner, but they conducted business honestly. They seemed genuinely curious about human culture and methods. Jack learned that the Krell had tested dozens of species over their long history. Most had either submitted immediately or fought stupidly and been destroyed. Only a handful had responded the way humanity did. Those few species earned Krell respect and were left to develop independently. As Jack entered his 50s and watched his children begin taking over ranch operations, he reflected on how far he had come from that cramped room on Kepler 9. He had been a broke engineer with no prospects and a stack of rejection messages from women who wanted someone wealthier. Now he owned a successful ranch on a thriving colony world. He had a strong marriage and healthy children. He had helped save his adopted planet from alien conquest. None of it had come from luck or inheritance or easy choices. It had all come from hard work, practical skills, and finding someone who valued those qualities. Kate stood beside him on the porch one evening watching the sunset, just as they had done countless times over the years. Their oldest daughter Helen was down at the processing facility, overseeing the day's final shipment. Their sons were checking the northern herds. Their youngest was inside doing homework. The ranch hummed with activity even as the day wound down. Kate took Jack's hand and squeezed it gently. She did not need to say anything. They both understood how fortunate they were. The story of Jack Morrison and Kate Sullivan became one of those tales that parents told their children on colony worlds across human space. It was a story about seeing value where others saw only limitations, about how the poorest person in credits could be the richest in character, about how practical skills and honest work mattered more than bank balances and inherited wealth, about how stubbornness and ingenuity were humanity's greatest gifts to the galaxy. But for Jack and Kate themselves, the story was simpler. They had found each other when both needed a partner who understood that life on the frontier required strength and determination. They had built something lasting together through daily effort and mutual respect. They had raised children who would carry on that tradition. They had demonstrated to an alien species that humanity would not be easily conquered or controlled. And they had done all of this while working a ranch on a beautiful planet under an open sky. That was enough for Jack. He had never wanted fame or recognition. He had only wanted a place to call home and a partner to share it with. He had found both on New Haven thanks to a woman who saw past his empty bank account to the person underneath. Every day since then had been a gift, even the difficult ones. The work was hard and the challenges never stopped, but Jack would not have chosen any other life. This was where he belonged, and this was who he was meant to become. The sun finished setting and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above. Jack knew that somewhere out there among those stars the Krell were traveling to other worlds and testing other species. Some would submit and some would fight, and a few might earn respect through stubborn refusal to accept domination. Humanity had passed that test on New Haven, and Jack had played his small part in that victory. But what he was most proud of was not the dramatic confrontation with aliens, but rather the quiet years of building a life worth defending in the first place.